Okay, in this video, I'm going to be talking about the problem of fake news, which is part of our video series about how algorithms are shaping society. And we're talking about via persuasion in this case. So these are the questions that we're going to be addressing to understand this problem a little more deeply. Okay, fake news. That includes two kinds of news, two kinds of information, I should say, misinformation and disinformation. So the difference between those two things is an organized intention to manipulate. Now, on the effect side, like how on the consequence side, mis and disinformation basically do the same thing. Disinformation is a result of an intentional attempt, to spread propaganda to deceive you, and misinformation is just a mistake. You didn't mean for it to, but it was the wrong information. It wasn't necessarily nefarious. So on the effect side, they both have the same kind of effect. But on the solution side, they're going to be different because they're going to have different ways to address, right, misinformation versus disinformation. Okay, so this graphic, I used it on another video as well. So we're saving the topic of deepfakes to talk about later. Deepfakes are relevant to fake news, but just when, in the sense that deepfakes deliver fake news. Again, this is addressed in a different video. We're talking about just fake news in general, whether or not it's delivered by a deepfake. Okay, so what is old about this problem? Well, mis and disinformation, exactly as old as civilization itself, right? People started telling lies and making up stories of things that didn't happen, ever since people have been around to talk. Okay, so, what do we do about that? Well, there's two real big difficulties. First of all, who decides what is fake? I mean, there's certain contexts where there's like obvious factual information that's being misrepresented, and it's like, okay, so this is. But oftentimes, words can be used in really subtle, tricky ways to spin things, to create different kind of context, to create half-truths. And it's a labyrinth of like confusion where it's really difficult to tell, what exactly is true and what's not true. But secondly, even when we do say, okay, this is definitely fake, right? This is intended to manipulate people. This is propaganda, okay? But what do we do about it at that point? Well, the first thing, again, like throughout all human history, it's like when you discover this fake news, your first reaction to it is to say, okay, we need to censor this, right? We need to make sure this information doesn't get out. Two problems there, two things that we need to be really cautious of. First of all, there's a direct line between censorship, even good, well-intentioned censorship, and corrupt centralized power, especially government power, but it could be corporate power as well. So as soon as people start down the censorship road, things get really sketchy really fast, and we need to be careful about that. Second of all, people really like having autonomy. And in this case, the autonomy that we're referring to is free speech, right? So when you start censoring people, regardless of the context of whether they deserve it or not, they don't like it. And the censorship a lot of times backfires, just because people are really hostile to, hey, you're telling me I can't express my point of view, my opinion, and then the censorship actually does more harm than good. So we need to think about more intelligent, more subtle strategies to deal with fake news than just censorship, even though that's the most tempting way to deal with it. All right, what's new about this problem? So that's what's old about the problem. What's new because of the scale of digital technology? Okay, well, so when we tell news stories, there's a long, important history of journalistic standards, journalistic integrity, journalistic best practices about how to convey news to the public that is trustworthy. It was much easier to enforce those standards, to hold news organizations to account when there were just a few news organizations. So, it's this interesting thing. Throughout most of human history, we had all these pockets of people just spreading disinformation. Then there was a brief time where information was more or less centralized. There was only 3 or 4 main news outlets, at least in the US, that everybody got their news from. And that made vetting a bit easier to make sure that we're holding people to account about their news standards. But now things are fracturing once again. And so, now there's not dozens, not even hundreds, but thousands of little news venues. And so, almost anybody with an internet connection can become one of those venues and in a couple days make their own LLC and their own news site, and now they're distributing news. So that is, from a fake news perspective, that's troubling because, we just can't expect that regular people, the people who decide on Tuesday, I'm going to start a business distributing news. I start a news organization on Thursday. They're up and running because they got the LLC and they got the website. We just can't expect that those kind of folks are going to hold themselves to standards of journalistic integrity. And it's really difficult to figure out how we're going to hold them accountable from the outside. Again, this is not a case where it's like NBC, ABC, CBS, Fox, and now it's like, okay, so what are the 4 big players saying? And then, things are much more splintered now. So, for example, in 2024, it was discovered that there were certain conservative commentators that were getting paid a pretty good amount of money to distribute Russian propaganda. So Putin had some talking points. He's like, all right, I'm going to pay the conservative commentators who are popular to distribute these talking points. As far as I can tell, there hasn't been any serious consequences once that was discovered. I'm sure it was a little bit embarrassing for the people, but maybe it wasn't even embarrassing. Maybe they didn't even feel shame. Maybe they didn't even care. They just cashed their check and people forgot about it and moved on. I have to think that, if this were in the era when there were 3 or 4 news organizations, there would have been more serious consequences if one of the reporters was discovered to be, getting paid by the Kremlin to distribute propaganda. But that accountability just isn't there. All right, what's new because of the capabilities of digital technology? Well, I think you know this one. So algorithms give you the news that you want, right? So algorithms know a bit about you, maybe a lot about you, maybe even some things about yourself that you don't know about yourself. And they are able to feed you news stories that you are going to want to consume. And so, that's troubling because this is the metric that is being used is maximizing engagement, right? So was the algorithm successful in pushing you news stories that you liked, right? If so, if you stayed on the platform longer, then that's a win. Now, if we think about this from a perspective of journalistic integrity and journalistic standards, that it's not clear how that at all fits, right? So distributing news, it was never supposed to be about maximizing engagement. Of course, there has to be a sense where people want to read your paper, want to read your source. It can't be so boring and lame that people are like, I don't want it. But the maximizing engagement metric just doesn't leave any room for journalistic standards. Or maybe it does, but it's not clear how much room it leaves. All right, we're talking about trust here, very clearly. If people can't trust the news that they're reading, then they don't trust anything, even the true ones. And so the fake ones have a great chance to proliferate and just erode people's trust in institutions and in each other. So that's a real bad thing. All right, what are some potential solutions? Well, I mentioned platforms where that allow people to be content distributors. And so, that enters us into the world of content moderation. That's not censorship, although some people feel like content moderation sometimes feels like censorship to them. But content moderation is this really important responsibility that platforms and other kinds of organizations have to make sure that what is happening on their website is okay, right? Now, that is difficult, and it's difficult for a very specific reason. So there is an act from 1996, the Communications Decency Act, and there's this notorious section, 230, which says, for one thing, that platforms are not legally responsible for the content posted by their users. It's like, hey, I just made the platform. My users are the ones who posted the content. So that's third-party content, and so, Meta is not responsible for what people post. They're not legally responsible for it, right? So, platforms are still going to want to moderate content for various reasons, but they're not held responsible for their moderation decisions. So probably, most platforms aren't going to want people to be able to say anything, right? That's going to be bad for business. That's, if there's, extreme badness like child trafficking kinds of things, or like just really aggressive hate speech, most platforms would be like, oh, we don't want this on our site because we want people to use it. And so they're going to be making some moderation decisions, but they're not necessarily transparent or accountable for what those decisions are, even when they're good, right? And a lot of times they might not be very good. Content moderation is really tricky. Requires a lot of ethical sensitivity, and people can be really smart and try really hard and still not get it right. So this is not easy, but I think Section 230 is making it even harder. So there's a lot of advocates for 230 reforms, sometimes they're called, because a lot of people feel, including myself, that Section 230 might have been well intended in various ways, but it needs some updates and edits now that we're not in the second millennium anymore. Another thing to think about is, we can start with this fact, is that there are some fairly good ways to keep yourself from being deceived, manipulated by fake news, right? So just media literacy, just how do I verify, developing a healthy skepticism about news sources, watching out for language that's particularly explosive or manipulative, those kinds of like red flags, right? So, on the one hand, of course, that's just for me, right? You can educate you. That's how you protect yourself. But we can also use those best practices to turn around and say, okay, so how can we educate people at the level of society about how to, how people in general can be these, develop this kind of literacy. And if we get enough people to develop the literacy, that really puts a huge burden on distributors of fake news, right? Because if you have a critical mass of people who can think critically about the news that they're consuming, then it's much harder for the fake news to be distributed. So this is about creating a different kind of context. And really, I think this has to be done through education. There's a quote sometimes attributed to Thomas Jefferson, although who knows if he actually said it or whatever. It goes something like, an educated citizenry is a vital requisite for our survival as a free people, right? So education has always been important, and it's just going to keep on being important, and even more important now that there's a million ways for people to get their news, and so many things can bombard your senses and your thoughts online. It's just, we have to develop not only education for ourselves, but a culture of education, a culture of healthy skepticism that doesn't just accept something because it happens to be, written in letters on their screen. So those are a few thoughts about the problem of fake news.